was at a dinner recently in Dubai, sitting across from a guy who'd spent the last hour detailing what he called the greatest heist of the century.
Oh, one of those conversations.
Exactly. He had his phone out, scrolling through these grainy satellite images of mines, social media threads filled with, red arrows pointing from Khartoum to the Emirates.
The whole conspiracy board on a smartphone.
He was leaning in so far, his tie almost touched his soup, and his voice was trembling with this kind of certainty you only see in people who think they've uncovered a global secret.
Right.
"It's the gold," he whispered. "Sudan is the UAE's engine. Without that gold, the whole economy here would stall." He was just so convinced.
He was selling a narrative, a simple, compelling story.
A story of a geopolitical mastermind's playbook, where one country fuels a war just to keep its coffers full. He talked about blood gold and looted billions with this feverish intensity, practically waiting for me to gasp.
That you didn't.
I didn't. Instead, I pulled up a single spreadsheet on my phone, the latest Ministry of Foreign Trade report, and I just slid it across the table. I asked him to look at two numbers. First, the total value of gold passing through the UAE, $186 billion.
A massive number.
Then, the value of gold imported from Sudan, $1.97 billion. I watched his face as he did the mental math.
And you could see the gears turning.
The engine he'd been describing wasn't an engine at all. It was 1.06% of the trade. It was a rounding error.
Right.
His expression just shifted from this righteous indignation to total confusion in about 3 seconds. The grand narrative of a resource-driven proxy war it hit the cold wall of a decimal point and shattered.
That silence must have been powerful.
That silence at the table is what haunts me. Because if the UAE doesn't actually need that 1% to survive, if 1.97 billion is statistically irrelevant to a global hub, then the reasons people are dying in El Fasher and Khartoum aren't about the gold at all.
Which means the tragedy is even worse.
It's so much worse. A nation is being torn apart for a prize that doesn't even move the needle on a global ledger. When the math collapses the myth, you're left with a much darker question. If it's not about the money, what is this war actually for?
And that, is exactly the mission of this deep dive. We are peeling back that easy, sensational narrative, the blood gold conspiracy that feels, so satisfying to believe.
It's a clean story. A good guy and a bad guy.
It is. But we have to move beyond it to confront 3 much darker and more complex truths that the data just forces us to accept. We have to move beyond the comfort of a simple villain.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've established the central tension. What are the 3 core areas we need to cover to truly understand the dynamics here?
Okay, first, we have to grasp the sheer statistical irrelevance of Sudanese gold to the global financial system, particularly the UAE's massive economy. This section, it just destroys the motive for a geopolitical gold grab.
The motive just disappears. Got it. What's second?
Second, we have to pivot from searching for external villains to diagnosing internal collapse. We'll look at how Sudan's domestic elites intentionally weaponize that external resource war myth to deflect attention from their own catastrophic structural failures.
So, using the myth as a smokescreen.
Precisely. And finally, we'll explore new analytical frameworks, specifically disaster capitalism and social functionalism, that better explain the persistence and profound nature of this conflict than, the traditional outdated theories.
And this means we have to see the chaos not just as something that happens,
but as a condition that is actively exploited for profit.
Let's start right where we left off with the numbers. To really appreciate that 1.06% figure, we need to zoom out and understand the immense scale of the financial system we're talking about.
Yeah, that context is everything.
The UAE isn't just a thriving regional market. It is actively positioning itself as the global epicenter of gold trade.
And the scale is, it's truly monumental. The UAE officially surpassed the UK in 2023.
The UK? That's huge.
It is. They solidified their position as the world's second largest gold trade hub. And their ambition is clear. They want to be number 1.
The trade volume numbers show that, right?
They absolutely do. Their reported trade volume in gold has just soared, climbing from around 129 billion in prior years to a massive 186 billion reported in 2024.
So this isn't just organic growth. This is a strategy.
It's the product of calculated geopolitical strategy and really advanced infrastructure planning. It's not an accident.
It sounds like this isn't just about local trade then, but about a fundamental reshaping of global finance.
It absolutely is. This rapid ascent is deeply linked to what people are calling the Asian century for precious metals.
And you can track this back to global geopolitical volatility.
For sure. Specifically, the increasing use of Western sanctions, like the ones imposed on Russia, this has created massive uncertainty among central banks worldwide.
Making them rethink everything.
It's causing them to seriously rethink their reliance on the US dollar as the primary reserve currency.
And what do banks do when they feel uncertain about the dollar?
They buy gold. It's the oldest move in the book. We've seen record central bank gold buying and a concerted effort toward what's called repatriation of bullion.
Moving it out of traditional vaults in places like London and New York?
Exactly. Getting their physical gold back on home soil. And the UAE saw this coming. They strategically leveraged their advanced infrastructure, their non-aligned political position, and their logistical capabilities to become the alternative corridor.
The new safe haven, so to speak.
They are effectively reshaping the global trade architecture. They're providing a reliable, swift, and highly advanced clearinghouse for BRICS nations and, anyone else looking to diversify away from Western-dominated financial systems.
So they have built a fortress of finance, drawing gold from major mining operations and central banks globally. This is what makes that $1.97 billion figure from Sudan such a brutal, almost insulting joke.
It really is.
Let's revisit the Ministry of Foreign Trade data that completely undermines that geopolitical conspiracy narrative.
That data from 2024, it's the cold, hard reality check. The total value of gold passing through the UAE is that staggering 186 billion figure.
And the specific value of gold imported from Sudan
is 1.97 billion.
That $1.97 billion is a tiny, almost invisible thread in a massive tapestry. It equals 1.06% of the UAE's total gold trade.
And it gets even smaller.
It does. If you compare that dollar amount against the total national economy, it's less than 0.4% of the UAE's gross domestic product.
This is the crucial analytical moment. This is where the story collapses. When we apply the logic of statecraft and financial management, the conspiracy theory just evaporates.
Right. You have to ask the question.
Would any rational state, let alone one that has spent decades meticulously building its global reputation as a stable, meritocratic financial hub,
A reputation they guard fiercely.
would they risk that entire reputation, their political stability, their diplomatic relationships, potentially inviting international sanctions for an economic input that represents a statistical rounding error, less than 0.5% of its GDP?
The answer is clearly no.
Yeah.
That decision would be economically suicidal for a global hub.
Exactly. The cold, hard logic suggests that the instability in Sudan, while tragic, is economically irrelevant to the broader stability of the UAE's financial system.
They've insulated themselves.
The scale and robustness of their $186 billion system provides a structural defense against regional chaos. They have buffered against it.
This analysis really forces us to adopt a perspective we rarely encounter when discussing conflict resources. The perspective of, say, the compliance officer, the regulator.
That internal view is critical. Let me share something that brings this to life for you. It really gets at this idea that the evolution of the UAE into a premier global gold hub demonstrates how the implementation of rigorous meritocratic regulatory frameworks renders this kind of instability economically irrelevant.
It's a viewpoint from the ground up, inside the regulatory tower.
Yes, from the person whose job it is to protect the system.
Give us a feel for what that means practically. How do they buffer against conflict gold?
Okay, so over the last 5 years, the UAE has significantly beefed up its, let's call it a regulatory framework defense. And this was done specifically to manage the risks associated with conflict resources.
This wasn't altruism then?
Not at all. It was done out of a need to gain and maintain the trust required to handle $186 billion in global trade. If your system is perceived as leaky or compromised,
that capital goes elsewhere very, very quickly.
Instantly.
So what are the specific components of that framework? We hear acronyms like AML and KYC thrown around all the time, but what do they mean in this context?
They mean rigorous, mandatory anti-money laundering, or AML, and know your customer, or KYC, protocols that extend far beyond simple paperwork.
This isn't just ticking a box.
No way.
Yeah.
For a company to be onboarded as a supplier in the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, for example, they have to undergo enhanced, multi-stage due diligence, both on-site and off-site.
What does that involve?
It involves validating the ultimate beneficial ownership of the sourcing company, tracking the chain of custody for the minerals, and verifying all transport and payment methods.
So it's not just a declaration, it's a verifiable audit trail from mine to market.
Precisely. And they mandate annual third-party audits. Furthermore, the UAE standards meet or even exceed the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas.
And the OECD guidelines are the international gold standard, right?
They are. They demand a 5-step framework, establishing strong management systems, identifying and assessing risks in the supply chain, designing and implementing a strategy to respond to those risks, conducting independent third-party audits, and publicly reporting on supply chain due diligence.
That's far more rigorous than just saying, we don't buy blood gold. That level of compliance requires massive investment in infrastructure and expertise.
Absolutely. This risk-based approach, backed by strict oversight and professional training for all actors in the supply chain, is designed specifically to mitigate the entry of conflict-affected gold into the legitimate trade.
So from that compliance officer's perspective.
From their perspective, the entire argument hinges on the fact that the UAE has built a system so robust that regional instability is an economic irrelevance. The motivation for the state to risk its $186 billion reputation for a $1.97 billion rounding error simply does not exist.
The numbers force us to conclude that if external resource greed isn't the primary driver, then the conflict's source must be internal. This leads us directly to the dynamics within Sudan itself.
Right. If the math collapses the myth of external greed, we have to immediately pivot our focus to internal institutional failure. And this is where the traditional resource curse theory offers a crucial, though, incomplete starting point.
So, resource curse theory suggests that having a lot of valuable natural resources isn't always a blessing. It can actually be a trigger for internal instability and poor governance.
Correct. The theory suggests that instability is the result of internal dysfunction, chronic governance failures, intense winner-take-all competition among elites for resource rents.
And just weak institutions.
Exactly. Institutions like the central bank, customs, and the treasury that are simply too weak or too corruptible to manage that wealth properly.
And in Sudan, gold fits the resource curse model perfectly because of how it's extracted.
It's the ideal resource curse commodity. While there is some industrial mining, the majority of Sudan's production comes from artisanal and small-scale gold mining, or ASGM.
And that kind of mining creates a specific kind of resource.
It creates the classic lootable resource. It requires minimal sophisticated infrastructure to extract, it's easy to smuggle across porous borders, and it's highly fungible, meaning it's easy to sell internationally outside of formal state control.
This structure is the foundation of a parallel war economy.
It's the perfect recipe for one.
And the power dynamics show exactly how this played out. The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, didn't just stumble upon this wealth.
No, not at all. The RSF, commanded by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti, gained control over key gold mines in regions like Darfur, as well as crucial areas in northern and River Nile states.
And by controlling the source, they could control the profits.
By funneling these profits outside the central bank, they created a massive, independent, and flexible funding stream for their operations.
So when those profits go directly to Hemeti's network, it dramatically strengthens the RSF's autonomy and military capacity.
Yes, making them beholden to no one but themselves.
This is the critical feedback loop of the resource curse, isn't it?
It is. The independent funding source ensures that conflict becomes more profitable than participating in the difficult, unglamorous work of building a peaceful state. Every attempt at durable governance is immediately undermined by these informal resource flows.
Because the war literally pays for itself.
The war pays for itself.
We have to remember that this current conflict is much older than the gold rush, though. It's rooted in a deep political history. It's a fundamental power struggle.
Absolutely. We have to define the historical conflict clearly. The roots lie in Sudan's long-standing political economy. The historical concentration of power and wealth among a secured central elite.
Often drawn from specific Nile Valley ethnic groups.
Yes, at the expense of the peripheries, such as Darfur, Kordofan, and the eastern states.
So the current war is really a clash between two fundamentally different types of elite structures.
Precisely. On one side, you have the established military political elite, The Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, which has historically governed Sudan, they represent the central state-sanctioned military power.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the emerging militarized elite, the RSF. They rose out of the Darfuri Arab militias, the Janjaweed groups, and through their control of resources like gold, they achieved an unprecedented political, economic, and military elevation at a national level.
That rise directly challenged the SAF's monopoly on power and wealth. It was an existential threat to them.
It was a zero-sum confrontation. The SAF's entire existence was predicated on maintaining the established political order where they sat at the top. The moment the RSF achieved national legitimacy and economic autonomy, the collision became inevitable.
And the immediate trigger for the violence in April 2023 was the negotiations around security sector reform, or SSR.
Yes, under the Civilian Military Framework Agreement.
What made the SSR talks the flashpoint? It sounds academic, but it was anything but.
It was about survival. The key issues were integration and the chain of command. The SAF wanted the RSF forces, numbering perhaps 100,000 fighters, to be integrated into the formal military within 2 years.
Which would dissolve the RSF as an independent entity.
Exactly. Hemedti, knowing that immediate integration meant losing his independent power and his resource streams, he demanded up to 10 years for the transition.
10 years is basically maintaining the status quo and securing his position. 2 years is political oblivion for the RSF.
It left no room for compromise. This wasn't about agreeing on a budget or a timeline. It was about the fundamental structure of the Sudanese state and who held the gun.
And when the power structure is that zero sum, violence is the only alternative to capitulation.
Which brings us back to that deflection tactic.
Right. If the conflict is about this desperate internal power struggle, why do the elites keep pushing the gold conspiracy narrative? Why blame the outside world?
It's a classic defense mechanism. Blaming external actors for the theft of national gold is a strategy used by these failing elites to hide their own role in the structural collapse of the state. It gives them a rhetorical shield.
It's a way to create a common enemy.
It is. We can look at this through the eyes of the people on the ground. This whole situation, it reveals how these failing institutional elites weaponize resource narratives to deflect from their own role in the state's collapse.
Unpack that reality for us.
Imagine an elderly man, let's call him Omar, sitting in the dust of a displacement camp on the outskirts of Port Sudan. In a video clip, he's watching a flickering television where a high-ranking military official is shouting about foreign hands and the theft of our national gold.
And what does Omar think?
Omar just shakes his head because he remembers when his sons were still home, before the streets of Khartoum turned into a chessboard for two generals. For him, the abstract talk of gold being stolen feels like a ghost story.
A story told to distract from the real problem.
A story told to children to distract them from asking why their house was burned down. He knows the rich gold mines are hundreds of miles away, yet the bullets, the starvation, and the displacement are right there in his neighborhood.
So the elites weaponize this narrative because it's easier to blame a distant global conspiracy.
A massive, shadowy villain than to admit that they, the domestic actors, have dismantled the very state they were meant to protect.
That bitterness, that sense of being used as a prop in a performance about stolen wealth, while the actors on stage are the ones actually causing the tragedy. That's what makes this so dark.
It's incredibly dark.
They're destroying cities, displacing millions, and causing famine, all for a prize that is a microscopic fraction of the global market. They distract the Sudanese people and the world from their own institutional suicide.
It summarizes the tragedy perfectly. But even resource curse theory, focusing only on elite competition and internal corruption, doesn't capture the full scope of the failure.
It's not deep enough.
We need to go beyond political corruption and look at the total collapse of the social fabric. This brings us to the more profound framework of social functionalism.
How does social functionalism provide a deeper diagnostic tool for understanding this specific conflict?
Well, social functionalism fundamentally posits that stability, or social order, exists only when the various parts of society, the political system, the economic system, the social trust, all work together to maintain the equilibrium of the whole.
So conflict and instability aren't rational struggles.
They're not primarily rational cost-benefit struggles. They are clinical symptoms of a total system breakdown.
So the conflict is not a rational struggle over mineral wealth, but a symptom of a body where every organ has stopped working together.
Precisely. This framing is captured so well by the experience of a doctor who stayed in Omdurman after the war began. For him, examining the war through this lens of social functionalism shows that it's a clinical symptom of a total breakdown in domestic authority.
It's not about geopolitics for him.
Not at all. He wasn't concerned with the gold mines or international trade routes. For him, the war was about the fact that no one was picking up the trash, the rule of law had vanished, and the basic social contract had been shredded into confetti.
He called it a clinical collapse of authority.
Yes. In his view, the war is a symptom of a systemic failure. When the state completely fails to provide safety, basic services, or justice, well, social disorder just takes over.
The basic agreement, I obey the laws and you keep the lights on and stop people from killing me, that just evaporates.
It's gone.
That makes the focus on gold feel almost misleading. It's more comforting to think people are fighting for money than to admit they are burning a country down because the structural systems have imploded.
It's a dark realization, but a necessary one. Sudan has a long documented history of high political instability, severe marginalization through imbalanced development programs, and deep conflicts of identities, ethnic and tribal strife, all of which lead to social disorder. The violence is simply the final manifestation of that system failure.
If functional collapse is the issue, then the solutions must address the structural inequalities, not just the military dynamics. What does a functionalist approach demand for recovery?
It requires addressing the deep structural roots of inequality that caused the breakdown. Under the functionalist framework, enhancing social integration and achieving sustainable peace requires three linked policy processes: recognition, representation, and redistribution.
Let's break those down. What does recognition mean in the context of Sudan?
Recognition means acknowledging the dignity, history, and unique contributions of Sudan's immensely diverse groups and cultures. The historical power structure was based on cultural and economic dominance by a central elite.
So it's about dismantling that cultural hierarchy.
It is. Recognition demands reversing this by ensuring mutual respect and cooperation among all groups, including those previously marginalized groups like the various communities in Darfur and the eastern states.
And representation. That seems critical, especially given the history of centralization.
Representation means guaranteeing that the diverse interests of all ethnic, regional, and political groups are taken into account in political decision-making. This means decentralized governance and proportional political structures that prevent any single elite from monopolizing authority.
Without it, you get militarization.
Without genuine, guaranteed representation, marginalized groups will always seek parallel, autonomous means to protect their interests, which is often what results in militarization, like we saw with the RSF.
Finally, redistribution. How does that relate to a gold conflict that we now know isn't really about gold?
Redistribution is the economic component. It means deliberately redirecting socioeconomic resources, wealth, infrastructure, investment, development programs, away from the historically privileged center and toward the long-deprived peripheries.
This counters the economic deprivation directly.
It does, and it reduces the incentive for groups to engage in conflict for immediate private gain. The violence will only cease when participation in the state offers more benefit than autonomous resource extraction. Until then, the violence remains a clinical symptom of a failed system.
We've established that the gold myth collapses under simple math, and the root of the crisis is internal institutional rot and functional collapse. But that doesn't absolve external actors. They may not be driving the conflict for the gold, but they are absolutely profiting from the chaos the warlords created. This is where we need to introduce our third framework, disaster capitalism.
This framework shifts our entire analytical lens. Resource curse theory, as we discussed, blames internal failures. Disaster capitalism, a concept popularized by Naomi Klein, posits that large-scale crises, wars, coups, natural disasters are actively and intentionally exploited by external actors.
So governments, corporations, financial institutions.
Exactly.
What's the goal of this exploitation?
The goal is to implement radical, profit-driven agendas that would be politically impossible in peacetime. This means rapid privatization of state assets, extreme deregulation of key sectors, and resource extraction deals are pushed through precisely while the domestic population is distracted and unable to resist.
So it shifts the focus from just blaming internal dysfunction to recognizing how global structures facilitate and benefit from this perpetual instability.
Yes. The crisis isn't an accident. It becomes a sustained market opportunity for offshore wealth accumulation and strategic gain.
And we have specific documented evidence of this transactional relationship playing out in Sudan. Even if the gold volume is statistically irrelevant to the UAE's macro GDP, it's about opportunistic access.
It's absolutely about transactional opportunism. The UN panel of experts has documented that despite the UAE's regulatory frameworks, they provided material support, including weapons, drones, and crucial logistical backing to the RSF.
And this support was often disguised.
Often disguised as humanitarian or commercial shipments.
And what was the clear return on that investment, if not a macroeconomic dependence on the gold?
The return was privileged, deregulated access. The UAE gained access to Sudanese gold through companies tied directly to the RSF leadership, like Al Ghanaid, which operates completely outside of the formal state structure.
They bypass the central bank entirely.
Which is the perfect alignment with the disaster capitalism model. The crisis creates a new, profitable, and highly flexible supply chain by enabling extraction that circumvents all state regulatory oversight.
So the goal isn't sustaining the UAE economy. It's reshaping Sudan's economy to benefit the external actor.
Yes, turning chaos into an opportunity for strategic influence and offshore profiteering.
This exploitation is clearly bipartisan in the conflict, though. It's not just a Gulf play. We see foreign governments capitalizing on the SAF side as well. Let's look at Iran as a counterexample.
Iran is a perfect mirror image of the transactional nature of this crisis, supporting the other faction. Iran reestablished its significant presence in Sudan by capitalizing on the SAF's desperate need for military allies and arms shipments after the RSF attacked Khartoum.
In return for those arms, what did Iran secure?
They secured infrastructure agreements, primarily for port access on the Red Sea, which is a strategically vital waterway. They also secured potential oil concessions.
So they're leveraging instability to extend their geopolitical and military influence in a critical choke point region.
Exactly. Both the UAE and Iran demonstrate how external powers embed themselves economically and militarily during times of chaos, ensuring they benefit from the disorder while simultaneously prolonging the conflict through sustained support for their chosen faction.
They are investing in instability itself.
That's a perfect way to put it.
This sustained external exploitation raises serious questions about why traditional international aid and policy, often managed by huge institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, have failed to stem the violence. If resource curse theory is still the dominant framework for aid, where are the blind spots?
Traditional efforts are almost exclusively focused on domestic governance reform. They push for austerity measures like cutting critical fuel or food subsidies and promoting economic liberalization and transparency.
And these policies are based on the assumption that fixing internal corruption will fix the conflict.
But the disaster capitalism lens shows those measures can inadvertently sustain the crisis by ignoring the external profiteers.
How so?
By focusing so narrowly on domestic failure, these policies ignore or even facilitate the operations of external actors who profit from deregulation and instability. Worse, the very mechanisms designed to ensure good governance can fail dramatically in a conflict zone.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. International aid is often routed through central government frameworks to meet transparency and fiduciary benchmarks. When the Sudanese central government's control collapsed, groups like the RSF could easily block and divert aid deliveries in contested areas.
So the RSF uses humanitarian supplies as leverage over local populations, which only deepens the crisis.
Right. And the external actors who are supporting the RSF can claim they are merely supporting reform and transparency through the central mechanism.
It is a devastating irony. The very attempt to enforce good governance accidentally empowers the very armed groups driving the violence.
It's an institutional blind spot. And it's why we need a new approach.
If we adopt the disaster capitalism framework, what new pathways to accountability are required to disrupt this global marketplace of instability?
The policy solutions must fundamentally recognize both domestic vulnerabilities and external incentives. First, we need to move beyond symbolic gestures and implement targeted asset-freezing sanctions on actors, and not just the warlords,
but the entire network.
The corporations, financial entities, and logistics companies engaged in conflict resource exploitation and facilitating arms flows.
And since gold is the key currency, what needs to happen to the supply chain?
We need mandatory and comprehensive trade transparency for Sudanese gold and minerals. This means strengthening existing regulations like the OECD due diligence guidance, requiring all companies in the supply chain to track the origin of minerals rigorously, report on supply chain risks, and conduct independent audits to verify compliance.
This immediately disrupts the informal, crisis-enabled financing streams that benefit the RSF.
It chokes them off.
And finally, a mechanism to hold the foreign governments themselves accountable for intervening in the chaos.
Exactly. We require multilateral accountability mechanisms, potentially through the African Union or the UN specifically established to monitor foreign involvement and ensure external actors like Iran or the UAE are held responsible for contributing to instability. These mechanisms must have teeth.
Forcing a difficult conversation about global complicity in sustaining the chaos.
A very difficult but necessary conversation.
Moving from the theoretical frameworks and the hard data, we must ground this discussion in the catastrophic human reality of the conflict. The numbers we've discussed, that 1.06%, stand in brutal contrast to the cost of human life and suffering.
The scale of suffering in Sudan since April 2023 it's beyond comprehension. The data shows that more than 25 million people, over half the population, have been driven into extreme poverty.
And the displacement numbers are just as horrifying.
We are looking at over 10 million people forcefully displaced, creating one of the world's largest displacement crises, with people fleeing both internally and across borders to Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt.
And the economic shock to civilians has been immediate and devastating, exacerbated by the breakdown of all services.
The cost of basic living has skyrocketed. There has been a reported 290% increase in food prices, pushing millions to the brink of famine.
And these crises are all interconnected.
They are. They're compounded by devastating climate events like catastrophic floods and droughts, which destroy harvests and infrastructure. This leads to widespread infectious disease outbreaks like cholera and measles. It is a critical, complex, and convoluted emergency crisis on top of crises.
Getting aid to these millions of displaced and vulnerable people is clearly the central challenge when the state authority has clinically collapsed and warlords are actively diverting supplies.
Service delivery is a nightmare. Social assistance and basic services are frequently obstructed, compromised, or outright diverted by the warring parties, the SAF and RSF, who use their military control to block access to formal banking systems and essential infrastructure.
This systemic failure forces marginalized populations to rely exclusively on informal community support networks,
which are themselves highly vulnerable. But this is where the true resilience of Sudanese civil society emerges. They are bypassing the shattered state structures by drawing on a deeply rooted social contract, a foundational principle of mutual aid.
The concept of nafir.
That is correct. We have to highlight the vital role of Sudanese civil society and local resilience. They rely on this ancient concept called nafir, which translates roughly as the call to mobilize. This is the foundational social contract of mutual aid and collective work that has been essential to emergency responses for decades, long before this current war.
So these mutual aid groups, often composed of neighborhood resistance committees that emerged during the revolution, have become the actual government on the ground.
They are the lifelines. These mutual aid groups are key to decentralized responses. Since international organizations often cannot reach certain highly contested areas, these local groups, composed of volunteers from the affected communities, mobilize culturally sensitive approaches, provide basic medical care, operate community kitchens, and organize evacuations.
And by operating outside the failed military political structures, they're doing more than just providing aid.
They're fostering social cohesion and representing the potential for the restoration of democratic principles like accountability and social justice. They're rebuilding the social fabric from the ground up.
When we talk about international partners, humanitarian and development organizations, how must they shift their policy and funding to support this foundational recovery? The old models of centralized funding clearly just feed the problem.
The policy shifts need to be radical and decentralized. First, we must stop trying to fit these grassroots organizations into large, cumbersome multilateral funding templates.
We need more flexibility.
We need to increase support for mutual aid actors through flexible, predictable funding mechanisms. Diaspora financing is a proven, successful model that demonstrates high levels of flexibility and timely responses, yet multilateral agencies still suffer from bureaucratic delays.
These groups need funds today, not 6 months from now.
Exactly.
And the focus should move beyond simple cash or food handouts to address the integrated nature of the crisis.
Absolutely. We need to pilot integrated service delivery models that address multidimensional poverty simultaneously, meaning they address both economic deprivation and psychosocial trauma.
This is the idea of development accelerators.
It is. Finding evidence-based approaches that achieve multiple impacts cost-effectively.
Give us a concrete example of what integrated service delivery might look like on the ground.
For instance, a program wouldn't just give a mother cash assistance. It would integrate that cash transfer with structured psychosocial support sessions conducted in community kitchens or temporary health clinics. This immediately links economic relief with emotional and psychological recovery.
Which is vital because of the widespread trauma.
Widespread trauma, increasing tribal tensions, and the weakening social contract. Psychosocial interventions must be mainstreamed across all social assistance programs.
And where can this support be delivered if all state infrastructure is destroyed?
It can be delivered effectively through community-based platforms that still exist, even if they are temporary. We're talking about local hospitals, temporary community kitchens, religious institutions, and surviving schools. These are trusted platforms that foster local leadership and strengthen community protection.
Finally, we must ensure these interventions protect the most vulnerable subgroups, whose needs are often overlooked in large-scale emergencies.
That means actively promoting gender equality and social inclusion by designing specific cash plus care programs. These address the compound crises facing highly vulnerable groups, such as pregnant mothers and new mothers.
So providing cash plus access to prenatal and postnatal care.
Yes, or offering targeted cash assistance to adolescent carers who have had to take on adult responsibilities, along with food and health packages tailored for under-5 populations. The goal is to ensure interventions reflect the age and gender-specific needs that the conflict has exacerbated, strengthening the community from the bottom up. If we synthesize what we have covered, the complexity of Sudan's crisis is not rooted in simple scarcity, nor is it driven by a rational geopolitical gold grab, as the statistics clearly show. The crisis is, at its core, a profound clinical failure of domestic authority, a social and political system that is structurally broken down.
And that internal failure is then exploited.
Simultaneously and opportunistically exploited by global actors who use the resulting chaos as a financial and strategic marketplace. The resource curse explains the internal rot, but social functionalism explains the systemic breakdown of the social contract, and disaster capitalism explains why the rot is allowed to continue unaddressed by the global community.
And the frameworks we choose to interpret this crisis fundamentally shape the solutions we pursue. If we believe the warlord's deflection narrative that this is a gold war, we focus on sanctions that only target internal corruption. But if we recognize the structural collapse and the external exploitation, sustainable peace demands two things simultaneously.
Internal institutional reform and external accountability.
Internal reform based on recognition, representation, and redistribution, coupled with stringent international accountability for those who profit from the chaos. The ultimate tragedy of this war isn't that the gold leaves Sudan and ends up in a global hub. The tragedy is that Sudanese lives are being sacrificed, cities are being burned, and a nation is being destroyed for a prize that is statistically irrelevant on the global stage, proving the conflict is about ego and power, not resources.